The forest at night is never silent. Even when the wind fades and the branches no longer groan, the earth carries a rhythm only those who are truly alone can hear. Insects scrape against bark. Wings brush through the dark, and the quiet breathing of something unseen lingers on the edge of hearing. Most people dismiss these sounds as background noise, but for the one who stays awake, who listens too closely, every whisper becomes a message. Every pause feels like anticipation, and when the silence finally arrives, when even the smallest noise surrenders, the stillness itself becomes unbearable. Because silence is not peace. Silence means something is waiting. There are stories told in hushed voices of people who spent a single night alone in forgotten cabins, roadside houses, or broken-down farms. The stories share the same ending. Those people never spoke the same way again. Their eyes carried distance, as if the night had stripped them of something invisible. They returned home but left part of themselves behind, and the few who never returned at all left behind nothing but questions, as if the earth itself had swallowed their names. This is not about shadows leaping out of closets or ghosts slamming doors. It is about the kind of horror that seeps into the bones, the kind that convinces a person that they are no longer in control of their own thoughts, the kind that begins with something so small, so ordinary, that most people would ignore it. A light left on when it should be off. A door that resists when pulled shut. A clock that ticks one beat too fast. These are not accidents. These are openings. On a night when the moon stood full above the tree line and the field glowed with its pale reflection, a solitary house stood with its windows lit. It looked almost peaceful from a distance, a fragile beacon against the endless black. Yet the closer one came, the more wrong it felt. The grass seemed unnaturally still, unmoved by the wind. The smoke from the chimney hung too heavy, as if reluctant to rise. The fire outside burned but gave no warmth, its light sharp and thin. Something in the air pressed against the lungs, a weight that made breathing a deliberate act. Inside the house, a single person sat awake, aware that every minute of that hour stretched far longer than time should allow. The wood groaned beneath their feet as though something was moving just below the surface. Shadows along the walls lengthened unnaturally, stretching past the corners. Every object in the room seemed to observe. Chairs angled as if watching, the window reflecting more than it should, the door slightly ajar even when pushed closed. What unsettled the most was not what could be seen but what could not. The unseen always lingers louder than the visible. The faintest outline in the window gone when blinked at. The suggestion of footsteps above even though the roof was empty. A hand brushing the back of a neck though no one stood behind. For the one inside, the night became a labyrinth of questions. Was the sound in the floorboards part of the house or part of something that wanted to be let in? Was the cold creeping down the hall an open draft or the arrival of something that did not need doors? There are moments in which time itself feels unnatural. Seconds stretch, breaths hang suspended, and the body waits without knowing why. In that house on that night, the stillness swelled until even thought became heavy. Outside, the trees appeared to lean closer, bending toward the light as if pulled by something unseen. The forest carried no sound, not even the scurry of animals that normally owned the night. The silence thickened, alive, as though it had form and weight. And then came the feeling, the certainty that someone else was present. Not a visitor, not a passerby, but something that belonged to the night itself. It did not approach loudly. It did not need to. The presence was already inside, in the way the air pressed, in the way the walls seemed to breathe. Alone at night no longer meant solitude. It meant intrusion. It meant recognition. Those who have felt it describe the sensation as being observed by something patient, something with no need to rush. They say it knows the mind before it knows the body. It studies fear, lingers in hesitation, waits for denial to collapse into acceptance. Once it recognizes that you are aware of it, the game begins. The longer the night, the stronger it becomes. This story begins with that single hour, that stretch of darkness when one person realized that being alone was never the truth. Alone is a word the living cling to for comfort, but when the night unfolds, when the silence deepens, when the breath slows to hear what should not be heard, the truth is revealed. Alone is impossible. And so the question remains, what follows the one who listens too closely? What answers the call of the silent room, the flickering light, the restless forest? What waits in the hour when the night itself decides you are no longer unseen? The story has no easy answer, because some questions are not meant to be resolved. They are meant to haunt, to echo beyond the telling. And as the fire outside burns low and the house trembles in its silence, the hour begins. The house was never supposed to stand alone. When it was built, the land around it belonged to a settlement that tried to tame the forest with fences and farms. Old records suggest there were once 4 other homes scattered across the clearing, each built with the same rough timber, each warmed by the same fire. But the forest did not surrender easily. Harvests failed, livestock disappeared, and winters stretched longer than the calendars claimed. One by one, the homes were abandoned, their frames taken back by moss and rot. Only this house remained, clinging stubbornly to the earth as if the soil itself demanded at least one witness to the silence. No one spoke openly of why the others left. In the nearest town, just beyond the line of trees, people kept their voices low whenever the subject surfaced. They would talk about poor weather, about illness, about hunger, but there were details that did not belong in simple misfortune. Families vanished in uneven numbers, with children left behind or parents missing without trace. Farmers who had once sold their crops in the market were suddenly spoken of in the past tense, as though their names had dissolved overnight. There were never funerals. There were no graves to mark. The land seemed to swallow people whole, and the house that remained became the anchor for all of their absences. For those who dared to pass through the clearing in later years, there was always the same sensation. The ground seemed hollow, as though walking upon it risked breaking through to something waiting beneath. The trees on the edge of the clearing appeared taller than those deeper in the forest, bending slightly toward the empty space. Travelers swore that the air there felt heavier, as if each breath carried a weight that the body did not want to hold. Animals avoided it entirely. Deer would not graze, birds would not roost. Even insects fell silent once they crossed the invisible line. Over decades, the house aged, but never truly decayed. Boards warped, windows cracked, and the roof sagged under storms, but it never collapsed. Fires from lightning strikes consumed barns and fields nearby, yet the house stood untouched. Its persistence unsettled the town more than its emptiness. It was not cared for, but it did not surrender. Some whispered that the house itself refused to die. Others claimed it was not the house that resisted, but something within it that refused to release its hold. The one who chose to stay there did not come out of ignorance. They knew the stories, the warnings carried in lowered voices. They had heard the way older townsfolk would pause mid-sentence whenever the clearing was mentioned, as though naming it too directly risked calling it closer. And yet they still chose the house, insisting that isolation was what they needed. The town saw this as arrogance. To them, no one lived in that house out of choice. They were either pushed there by something unseen or pulled there by something they could not explain. The person who moved into the house carried reasons of their own. They had left behind a life crowded with noise and expectations. They told themselves that solitude would offer clarity, that the silence of the woods would calm what the noise of people could not. They wanted distance from the world, a chance to rebuild thought by thought, moment by moment. What they did not realize was that distance from the world does not always mean peace. Sometimes distance leaves room for something else to arrive. When they first entered, the air smelled of damp wood and dust, but also of something sharper, metallic, almost like blood that had dried long ago. The windows rattled slightly even when the wind was still, and the floorboards sagged with every step. They touched the walls and found them strangely cold, as though the house held on to winter even in summer. But they convinced themselves it was only neglect, the ordinary decay of a structure left alone too long. They set about cleaning, repairing, claiming the space as their own. At night, however, there was no denying the weight of the house. Sleep came only in shallow bursts, broken by small noises that did not match the rhythm of settling wood. It sounded instead like pacing, like someone moving slowly from room to room, pausing outside the door before retreating again. They told themselves it was the house remembering footsteps, echoes from years gone by. Yet every morning, the door they locked at night stood slightly open. Every morning, objects on the shelves were not in the same place they had been left. The community beyond the trees knew this pattern too well. They had seen it before. A newcomer arrives, convinced the stories are nothing but superstition. They settle in, laugh at the unease of others, and speak proudly of their independence. But within weeks, their laughter fades. Their words thin out, and their eyes begin to carry the same haunted distance as those before them. The town watches, never interfering, never offering help. They know that interference never works. Those who try to rescue the isolated often return changed themselves or not at all. As nights stretch longer, the person begins to sense what the settlers once knew. The forest is not empty, and solitude is never true solitude. The weight in the air does not belong to loneliness. It belongs to something older than the house, older than the settlement, older than the town itself, something that needs witnesses, something that uses silence as a trap. The house is more than a building in the clearing. It is an opening, a threshold. And those who live inside it do not simply spend their nights alone. They become part of the land's memory. The first nights passed in uneasy quiet, and the person who had chosen the house tried to settle into a rhythm. Days were spent repairing broken furniture, patching leaks in the roof, and clearing weeds that had grown high around the windows. The air in the daylight felt heavy but manageable, and the forest seemed less threatening when bathed in the glow of the sun. It was easy to believe that the house was just old, that the stories whispered in the town were exaggerations born of fear. But everything changed when night returned. The first sign was subtle. The house never slept. Even in the absence of wind, the walls shifted as though breathing. The floor creaked in patterns too deliberate to be dismissed as settling wood. It was not the random groan of timber, but a rhythm, a slow progression from one end of the hall to the other, pausing at the door before withdrawing again. The occupant told themselves it was imagination, that solitude sharpened the senses until the mind invented patterns. Yet the sounds grew stronger each night until denial was no longer possible. On the third night, they left a glass of water on the small table beside the bed. By morning, it had moved. Not far, just enough to catch notice. The first time, they blamed clumsy hands, forgetting where it had been placed. But the following morning, the glass had shifted again, the water inside untouched. On the fifth morning, it was on the opposite side of the table, and the faintest wet ring marked the wood where it had been before. Sleep became fragile, broken into fragments by the smallest disturbances. Sometimes it was the faint scrape of a chair leg on the floor. Sometimes it was the sound of breathing in the room. Too close, too steady to belong to them. They would sit up holding their breath, straining to hear more, only for the silence to collapse back into place. It left them uncertain whether the sound had been real or a product of exhaustion, and yet each time they awoke, the unease was heavier, as though the night itself was pushing closer. The forest, too, began to change. At dusk, the trees seemed to crowd the edges of the clearing, shadows stretching longer, bending inward. The animals that should have filled the night with sound remained absent. No owl called, no insect stirred, no small rustle of life moved through the undergrowth. The silence was not natural. It was purposeful. The air outside the house felt charged, like the stillness before a storm, but no storm came, only the sense of something waiting. One evening, while securing the shutters, the occupant saw it, a light flickering deep between the trees. It was not fire. It pulsed faintly, shifting between white and pale blue, hovering in the distance. At first they thought it might be a lantern carried by someone walking through the woods, but the light did not move with the rhythm of a human step. It hovered, disappeared, and then returned in a different place, always just beyond clear sight. The longer they watched, the colder the air grew around them. Their skin prickled as though unseen eyes studied them from the dark. They shut the window and refused to look again, but the faint glow lingered behind their closed eyelids long into the night. By the seventh night, the house no longer felt like a shelter. It had become a trap of narrow halls and whispering corners. Doors refused to stay closed, opening just wide enough to create a sliver of black between frame and wood. The attic creaked as if something moved above, though the space was too narrow for anyone to stand. Shadows seemed to thicken unnaturally, forming darker pools in the corners of rooms, shapes that suggested forms crouched and waiting. The occupant began to mark the doors with chalk, a desperate attempt to confirm whether they were truly moving. Each morning the marks had shifted, smudged as though brushed by a hand. In one instance the mark was not erased but altered, extended into a crude symbol they had never drawn. The sight of it chilled them more than the silence. It was not vandalism by strangers. The house was responding. Even the fire outside, once a small comfort, turned strange. The flames burned, but they cast shadows that did not match the objects around them. The house stood still, yet its shadow seemed to shift, bending toward the forest. And when the occupant sat beside the fire, they swore the flames bent away as if repelled by their presence. Every night carried the same unshakable impression. They were not alone. Not just watched, but studied. Not just haunted, but weighed, measured and recorded by something invisible. The feeling did not fade with morning light. It followed them into the day, hidden in the silence, pressing against every task. The longer they remained, the stronger the disturbances grew. Objects moved farther. Shadows lingered longer. The rhythm of footsteps grew louder, heavier, circling the room at night instead of simply passing by. Sleep became impossible. Fear became constant, and yet despite the mounting terror, they did not leave. Something in the house refused to let go. It was not just fear that kept them inside. It was the sense that the moment they stepped outside, something worse would follow. The forest loomed like a wall, dark and endless, and the house, for all its horrors, felt safer than the void of trees beyond. But safety was an illusion. Each night was longer than the last. Each night pressed harder against their mind. And as the 9th night fell, with the fire burning low and the windows reflecting strange shapes that did not belong, one thought echoed louder than all the others. The house was no longer just a place they lived in. It was a presence they had entered, and it was awake. The strangeness of the house did not reveal itself all at once. It was not a single event that shattered the illusion of safety, but a collection of small intrusions that gathered weight over time. Each detail, isolated, might have been dismissed. Together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore, and once the mind begins to see patterns in the dark, it cannot look away. The occupant began keeping notes, scratching words into a weathered notebook found in one of the drawers. At first, the entries were simple, accounts of doors opening, of objects moving, of sounds in the night. But over the weeks, the writing became frantic, the lines uneven, the ink smudged by shaking hands. The descriptions were not only of events, but of impressions, of a presence that thickened the air, of eyes felt but never seen. Words repeated themselves, circled, carved harder into the page, as if writing alone could force reality into submission. It watches, it waits, it wants. The notebook was not the first left behind. In a small cabinet under the floorboards, hidden beneath loose planks, the occupant discovered a second. The pages inside were brittle, yellowed, the ink fading into faint shadows. Yet the entries followed the same rhythm. First doubt, then confusion, then certainty. The earlier writer had also heard the footsteps. They had also marked the doors. They had also seen the symbols appear where none had been drawn. Their final pages broke into incoherence, words stacked on top of each other, unfinished sentences that collapsed mid-thought. The last legible line read simply, "The silence has learned my name." Outside the journals, there were marks on the house itself that did not belong to neglect. On the underside of the stairs, carved into the wood, were symbols that matched those drawn in the notebook. They were shallow, hesitant, as though carved in haste. On the walls of the attic, under layers of dust, were handprints too large and too high to belong to anyone who had ever lived there. The prints were smeared, streaked, pressed into the wood with unnatural force, as if something had tried to push its way out, or in. The town carried fragments of its own evidence. Whispered accounts told of hunters who returned pale and silent, refusing to walk near the clearing again. Old police reports spoke of missing persons last seen traveling past the forest. Their belongings were sometimes recovered, boots left at the tree line, bags torn open with contents scattered, but never bodies. Testimonies contradicted each other. Some swore they saw lights in the windows long after the house was abandoned. Others claimed the windows reflected more than the trees, images of people who should not have been there. Experts from outside were called once, years ago. A historian walked the clearing, studied the foundation stones, and spoke of rituals carved into the structure. He claimed the house had been built on land once marked by older cultures, places where boundaries between worlds were thin. He warned the town that keeping the house standing meant keeping the threshold open. But his warnings turned into rambling sermons, his voice breaking under the strain of conviction, until he was escorted out and never returned. A psychologist who examined one of the survivors described the symptoms as classic isolation-induced psychosis. Prolonged solitude, sensory deprivation, and fear, he argued, produced hallucinations of presence, voices, and touch. Yet when asked why every account included the same symbols, the same patterns, he could not answer. His conclusion dissolved into ambiguity. Possible shared delusion, possible environmental contamination. His words were calm, but his eyes betrayed unease. The evidence did not align. The notebooks insisted on repetition. The house carried physical marks. Testimonies agreed in patterns but differed in detail. Experts dismissed what they could not explain. Each source contradicted the others, yet all led to the same conclusion. The house was not empty. The occupants studied these fragments by firelight, the notebook open on their knees, the older one beside it like a warning. Each page they turned felt like retracing a path already walked by another, a path that ended in silence. Their hands shook as they copied the symbols, tracing the lines in an attempt to understand. But the longer they stared, the more the symbols seemed to shift, their angles bending subtly as if the marks were alive. And then came the voices. Not loud, not clear, but low murmurs that drifted from the corners of the room, slipping into the silence between breaths. Sometimes they came from the walls, sometimes from beneath the floor, sometimes from just behind the ear. The words were never fully heard, but their tone was undeniable. Calm, steady, patient. The occupant wrote them down phonetically, desperate to hold them still, but the lines of text never matched the sound. The writing looked different each time, as though it belonged to another hand. The more evidence collected, the less clarity emerged. Instead of answers, each discovery raised more questions. Why did the house resist decay? Why did symbols appear where no one had drawn them? Why did testimonies agree on footsteps and lights even when told years apart? And most haunting of all, why did every record end in silence, without resolution, without closure? Clues are meant to solve mysteries. But in this house, the clues only multiplied them. They suggested a presence that was not bound by time, that touched each generation with the same cold precision, that left just enough behind to prove it was real but never enough to understand what it wanted. And as the occupants stared into the flickering fire, notebook open before them, one thought pressed harder than the rest. Perhaps the evidence was never meant to explain. Perhaps it was meant to lure, to draw the mind deeper into the silence until there was no escape. Sleep had become impossible. The body still lay down at night, still closed its eyes in surrender, but the mind did not drift into rest. It circled endlessly, chasing sounds that were not supposed to exist, straining against the silence that pressed like a weight on the chest. Hours passed with no distinction between dream and waking. When the occupant closed their eyes, shadows moved behind their eyelids. When they opened them, the shadows remained. In that house, there was no boundary between night and thought. At first, fear had been sharp, like a knife against the skin. It came in bursts, moments of panic at the sound of a door creaking, moments of dread when a shadow stretched too far across the wall. But as nights multiplied, fear changed shape. It no longer spiked and retreated. It spread, slow and constant, until it coated everything. Eating felt pointless, a ritual with no comfort. Walking from one room to another carried the tension of entering unfamiliar ground. Even though it was the same house, every act became deliberate, heavy with hesitation, as though the house demanded permission for each movement. The mind began to fracture under the strain. Thoughts repeated themselves in circles. The same questions replayed without resolution. Why is this happening? Why me? What does it want? They whispered these questions into the dark, waiting for an answer, and sometimes, only sometimes, a sound stirred in response. A faint murmur, a breath in the air, not words but something that resembled recognition. Those moments brought no comfort. They only confirmed that the silence was not empty. The body, too, carried the weight. The skin grew pale, stretched tight across sharp bones as meals went untouched. The hands trembled even when still, a constant vibration that betrayed the effort of holding control. The eyes reddened with sleeplessness, the pupils widening unnaturally in the dark as if trying to match the house's endless gaze. Each step across the floor carried hesitation, not from fatigue but from the certainty that the house felt the weight of every movement. Isolation amplified everything. The town lay only miles away, yet it might as well have been another world. No one visited. No one asked. The silence from outside the clearing was as complete as the silence within it. And so the occupant was left with only their own voice, and soon even that voice began to sound unfamiliar. They spoke aloud to themselves at first for comfort, narrating tasks, naming objects, just to keep the air alive. But as time passed, the voice fractured, sounding distant, as though it belonged to someone else in the room. Sometimes, when they fell silent, the voice continued, low, faint, echoing words they had not spoken. The house seemed to feed on this collapse. The weaker the occupant grew, the stronger the presence became. Footsteps grew heavier. Shadows sharpened. The voices no longer lingered in the corners but moved closer, brushing against the edges of hearing like cold hands against the skin. Each time fear thickened, the house responded, as though drinking from it, as though fear itself was the offering it required. There were moments when the occupant tried to resist, moments when they forced open the shutters and let sunlight pour in, moments when they stood in the clearing and shouted at the forest, daring whatever lingered to reveal itself. But silence was always the answer, and silence was worse than any sound. It proved nothing, explained nothing, resolved nothing. It stretched endlessly until defiance crumbled into despair. The breakdown of the mind carried a rhythm of its own. First came doubt, then denial, then anger, then the slow erosion into acceptance. By the time acceptance arrived, it was not relief. It was surrender. The occupant no longer fought the idea of being watched. They no longer demanded explanations. Instead, they began to move with the house's rhythm, pausing when the footsteps paused, waiting when the silence thickened, turning their heads slowly when they felt breath on their neck. Fear was no longer separate from life. It had become the only way to live. The town sensed the change without ever seeing it. They spoke of a heaviness in the air that spread beyond the forest, a tension that reached into their dreams. Children woke crying without knowing why. Farmers found tools moved in their sheds, paths bent in ways they had not before. Even those who avoided the clearing felt the echo of its silence. It spread like a stain across their lives, unspoken but undeniable. The occupants' letters, those they managed to write before words collapsed, spoke of this contagion. They wrote that fear did not belong only to the house. It traveled like breath carried on the wind, like water soaking through the ground. The silence follows. It does not need walls. It does not need doors. It finds you where you are weakest. Paranoia grew until every shadow became a warning. Every pause in sound was an approach. Every dream was an invasion. The mind no longer distinguished between inside and outside, between the house and the forest, between waking and sleep. Life had narrowed to a single truth. Being alone at night was not solitude. It was exposure. It was standing uncovered before something ancient, something that studied without end, something that eroded the human spirit until it was nothing but a hollow echo. In the end, the greatest terror was not what moved in the house. It was the slow realization that the self, the voice, the thoughts, the will was slipping away. That the silence was not only outside but inside, pressing into the mind, hollowing it out. The occupant feared not death but the loss of the fragile barrier that made them human. And perhaps that was the true purpose of the house, of the clearing, of the silence itself, not to kill, not to terrify, but to consume the mind until nothing remained but the echo of fear. When the house's silence could no longer be ignored, when the stories of missing people and fractured minds spread too far to dismiss as superstition, attempts were made to explain it. The explanations never agreed. Each investigation began with conviction and ended with uncertainty, as though the very act of stepping into the clearing stripped certainty away. Still, the theories remain, layered over each other like shifting shadows. The first theory was practical, rooted in the ground itself. Some claimed the soil beneath the clearing was poisoned, that minerals or gases rose unseen from the earth, seeping into lungs and minds. They spoke of invisible currents of air that warped perception, of toxic roots that starved crops and animals alike. It was a theory that satisfied those who needed the comfort of science, those who feared stories of haunting more than haunting itself. Yet the soil was tested more than once and nothing unusual was found. No toxins, no chemicals, no evidence to support what had been whispered. The land remained as it always had, heavy, still, silent. Others turned their eyes to history. A local historian spoke of the clearing as a place of crossing, a threshold long marked by cultures that came before. He claimed the forest carried scars of rituals, of fires built not to worship but to ward away. The house, in his view, was built on ground that should never have held walls. It stood where boundaries between the living and the other had always been thin. He said the settlers who stayed did not create the silence. They disturbed it. They broke something that was never meant to be broken. His voice carried conviction, but conviction turned brittle when pressed for proof. His documents were scattered fragments. Oral stories passed through generations, blurred and reshaped by time. When he left the clearing, he looked older than when he entered. His shoulders bent, his eyes fixed on nothing. He refused to speak of it again. The police, too, attempted their explanations. They collected reports, cataloged disappearances, studied the journals left behind. Official records list missing persons, but the language is careful, restrained. Possible voluntary absence, mental instability, lack of evidence. They place the blame on the individuals themselves, on loneliness, on desperation, on the fragility of the human mind. They treated the house as no more than a setting, never the cause. Yet their reports carried contradictions. Officers who visited often resigned within months. Their notes trailed into confusion, their handwriting uneven, their words cut short. The official files are silent on why so many investigators never returned for second visits. A psychologist examined survivors, those who walked out of the house hollow, but still breathing. He called it isolation psychosis, hallucinations born of sensory deprivation and stress. He compared it to prisoners locked away in solitary confinement, to explorers lost in empty landscapes. He claimed the human mind, starved of contact, invents presences to fill the void. His theory explained voices, footsteps, even symbols. But when asked why so many survivors described the same details, the same pacing footsteps, the same shifting glass of water, the same symbols scratched into the walls, he had no answer. He shrugged, called it suggestion, the spread of stories infecting fragile minds. Yet his voice trembled when he said it. There were stranger theories, ones spoken only in whispers. Some claimed the house was a mouth, a living thing that fed not on flesh but on the mind itself. They set it open to those who entered, studied them, consumed them slowly until nothing remained but silence. Others believed it was not the house but the land, the forest itself, drawing strength from the fear of those trapped inside. They spoke of the trees leaning inward, of roots that reached deeper than the earth, of an ancient hunger that waited for human eyes to look into the dark. And then there were the paranormal believers. They said the house stood on a wound in the world, a tear where something pressed through. They spoke of entities older than names, older than gods, patient and watchful. To them, the silence was not absence, but presence. The voices were not hallucinations, but attempts at communication. The shifting objects were not tricks, but signs. They claimed the house was a beacon, a place where the barrier between worlds grew thin, where something on the other side reached across. Theories collided, yet none aligned. Each left gaps, questions unanswered, contradictions unresolved. For every practical explanation, there was an account that shattered it. For every dismissal, there was a testimony that bled conviction. The house refused to fit into human understanding, slipping from grasp each time certainty tried to hold it. And still, investigations continued. Wanderers came with cameras and recorders, determined to capture proof. Some left with static-filled tapes, blurred images, whispers caught on microphones. Others never left at all. The town no longer tried to stop them. They watched from a distance, knowing each new investigation ended the same way, with silence. In the end, the most chilling theory was not that the house was haunted, or cursed, or alive. It was that the house was none of these things, that the silence itself was the truth, that humans could not stand in true silence without being broken by it, that the mind left without noise, without life, without reflection, tore itself apart, inventing horrors to explain the void. But even that theory failed when confronted with the marks carved deep into the wood. The objects moved, the symbols repeated across decades. No theory solved the mystery. No investigation closed the case. The silence remained, patient, watching, feeding, and perhaps that was the answer itself, not to solve, but to endure. To know that some places refuse explanation, because they were never meant to be understood. The house does not end. That is the truth people find hardest to accept. Most stories offer closure, a beginning, a middle, an end that ties the pieces together. But the house resists endings. It resists conclusions. It stands in the clearing like a wound that never heals, its silence spreading outward, its presence lingering even after one leaves. Those who entered and returned carried the weight of unfinishedness. They could not explain it because there was nothing to explain. The silence was not a puzzle to be solved. It was the answer itself. The occupant, like those before, came to understand this. It was not sudden. Realization arrived slowly, in fragments, carried on sleepless nights and whispered voices. They began to see the house not as a structure but as a mirror. It reflected not what was visible, but what waited behind the surface of the human mind. The fear of being watched, the dread of isolation, the certainty that something moves in the dark, even when no one is there. The house revealed what people tried to bury, That solitude is never pure. Something always listens. They wrote this in their final notes, words trembling across the page. It is not the house. It is not the forest. It is not me. It is all of it together. It is the silence itself, alive. Their writing ended there, not with a scream, not with a plea, but with the quiet resignation of someone who had seen the truth and no longer fought it. Their notebook remained in the house, stacked atop the others, another layer in the endless cycle. The town never reclaimed the land. They let the clearing stand untouched, a boundary no one crossed willingly, yet the house could not be erased from their lives. It intruded in dreams, in sudden silences that fell over crowded rooms in the way shadows stretched too long at dusk. The clearing's silence leaked outward, shaping the edges of their days. No one admitted it aloud, but everyone felt it. And still strangers came, drawn by curiosity, by defiance, by the hunger to prove themselves immune to what had broken so many others. They came with cameras, journals, machines meant to measure what the eye could not see. They spoke of science, of bravery, of logic. They promised to solve what had remained unsolved. Yet their stories ended the same way. Objects moved, voices whispered, silence deepened, minds fractured. The evidence they gathered was never enough to convince others, but always enough to haunt themselves. Perhaps that is why the house persists. Not because it feeds, not because it wants, but because it does not need to explain. Its power is not in violence or spectacle. Its power lies in the way it unsettles the mind, in the way it leaves questions unanswered, in the way it erases certainty. It lingers because people cannot let go of what they cannot understand, and the silence grows because silence is patient. There are those who argue that the stories are exaggeration, that the house is only wood and stone, that fear is a trick of the mind, but even they hesitate when they pass near the forest. Even they pause when the air falls too still, when the night grows too quiet. Because deep down every person knows the same truth. Silence is never empty. Silence holds weight, and weight always comes from something. The house waits. That is what remains certain. It waits in the clearing, its windows cracked, its walls bent, its door forever ajar. It waits for the next person who believes they are strong enough to endure it. It waits for the next voice to whisper into the dark, for the next mind to crack beneath the strain. And when they come, and they always come, the silence will rise again, patient and endless, swallowing them piece by piece. So the story does not end here. It cannot. The clearing remains. The house stands. The silence watches. And as the night falls and the world slips into darkness, one question lingers, pressing itself into the back of every mind that dares to hear this tale. When the silence comes for you, when you wake to the sound of footsteps that should not exist, when you feel the weight of eyes in an empty room, will you call it imagination? Will you convince yourself you are alone? Or will you finally accept what the house has always known? Alone at night is never truly alone, and the silence is listening still.